Good morning, everybody. Welcome back again to our ABF lesson for Sunday, December 13th. For those of you that are here in person, I welcome you. There should be some notes that are printed there. You can grab a set on your way in. For those of you that are watching at home, if you go to our church website, fbchh.org, you should be able to go up and download those and print them off at your leisure and then fill in the blanks as we go along. Now, these are the same notes as last week. So for those of you that were here watching last week, don't worry, there doesn't need to be any new notes for this week. We're going to wrap up chapter 13 of Revelation today, and then going forward, we'll be wrapping things up. So we've been talking a lot about the war that is happening during this last 7 years of human history. The war between the kingdoms of the world on the one hand, and the kingdoms of the Lord and his Christ on the other. So two kingdoms that are going head to head. And for millennia, these two kingdoms have been fighting and struggling and battling. And now here at the end of human history, finally it's going to be narrowed. We're going to get a final conclusive winner. And the question that we're asking right now, and that John is trying to answer right now, is who are the forces that are behind the kingdom of this world? These people that are, this force that is antagonistic to God and to his people, where does that come from? Who leads the show? And what we find out in Revelation chapter 12 is that the first villain is called the dragon. And the dragon is later identified as the ancient enemy of Jesus, because he tried to kill Jesus from the moment Jesus was born. The ancient enemy of Jesus' mother, or the nation that birthed him, which is Israel, because when Jesus goes away, and the dragon's going to try to destroy her, so she has to run away from him. But then also he's identified as the ancient serpent, the one who's been plaguing humanity, going all the way back to the beginning in the Garden of Eden, back in Genesis chapter 3. This is the great enemy of the world. This is the great leader of this kingdom of the world that is only hinted at here and there in the Old Testament, but in the New Testament is given full clarity as to this evil, malevolent force in the world that is opposed to God and his people and that wants to bring a destruction to everything that God has made. And what we see from this dragon is that for a while he has access to heaven, and he uses that access to accuse believers before God day and night. And at some point in the future, he's going to be thrown down to the earth, and when he does, he's going to be angry. And he's going to have one final mission with whatever time he has left, and he knows that his time is short. He doesn't have a lot of time to do what he wants to do. His final mission is to wipe out as many Jews and Christians off the world as he possibly can before his time is up. And he's going to be very, very surgically devoted to this task. And I think in many ways, the text is pretty clear. He's going to be successful in a lot of ways. He's going to kill and destroy a lot of Christians, a lot of Jews during this last few years of human history. But he's going to have help, because he's not going to do this on his own. And what we have in chapter 13, which is our new information for today, is we're going to be taking a look at a couple of beasts, they're called, that rise up, one from the sea and one from the earth, that are going to lead the efforts of the dragon to exterminate God's people and to set up a counterfeit kingdom, a final kingdom of the world that is going to try to rival and banish God's kingdom forever. And the first beast appears in chapter 13, verse 1. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read verses 1 through 10, and then I'm going to make some observations about this particular beast. And I think we'll come to an idea of who this represents, and we're going to connect it back to some Old Testament scriptures, and we're going to have a good time. So here we go. The first beast, starting in verse 1. I saw a beast rising out of the sea, with 10 horns and 7 heads, with 10 diadems on its horns and blasphemous names on its heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's. Its mouth was like a lion's mouth. And to it the dragon gave his power and his throne and great authority. One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound. But its mortal wound was healed, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. And they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast. And they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast, and who can fight against it?" And the beast was given a mouth uttering haughty and blasphemous words, and it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. It opened its mouth to utter blasphemies against God, blaspheming his name and his dwelling, that is, those who dwell in heaven. Also, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. And authority was given it over every tribe and people and language and nation. And all who dwell on earth will worship it. Everyone whose name has not been written before the foundation of the world in the book of life of the Lamb who was slain. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. If anyone is to be taken captive, to captivity he goes. If anyone is to be slain with the sword must he be slain. Here is a call for the endurance and the faith of the saints. All right, here we go. Let's dive into this. Who in the world is this first beast? Now, I want to say this right from the get-go. This beast represents the power of the kingdoms of the world. That's the first blank there. Now, Daniel chapter 7 is a passage we already looked at, not in great detail, but we talked about it back under Daniel's visions. Daniel had the vision of the statue, right? The really awesome statue I drew for you last week. Well, he had a second dream, and the second dream was sort of like a repeat of the first dream, except instead of a statue with different parts representing different kingdoms, there were different animals that rose up out of the ocean, and those animals represented those same exact kingdoms. There was a bear, there was a leopard, there was a lion, okay? And interestingly enough, all of those references here appear about this beast, right? Look at verse 2. The beast that I saw was like a leopard. Its feet were like a bear's. Its mouth was like a lion's mouth, okay? So he uses those three, lion, leopard, bear. And I think it's to connect this vision to the vision of Daniel chapter 7 to make sure we understand that this guy is going to represent a leader in the world kingdom. In fact, he's going to start off as one of many leaders in the world kingdoms, and then he's going to rise above the rest, and he's going to take charge of a one world kingdom that's going to try to stand opposed to God's kingdom. Okay? The horns that he has, they represent earthly kings, right? The diadems, crown represents authority. This dude here is the present incarnation of all the destructive world forces of all of time that are arrayed against God. He sort of becomes the ultimate example of a world kingdom guy, right? He's Nebuchadnezzar on steroids. He's Darius the Mede and Cyrus the Mede on steroids. He's Alexander the Great on steroids. He's every Roman Caesar on steroids. He is like the worst Hitler figure on steroids. He is the ultimate example of the power of the kingdoms of the world. That's why it says he emerges from the sea. A lot of times in the Old Testament, the sea, the chaotic nature of the sea, represents the nations, the Gentile world. So this is not a Jew. This is a Gentile who's going to rise up and he's going to become a king and authority over the kingdom of the world. He's going to be the central figure of this kingdom of the world, which is against the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ. Okay? Now, what else do we know about him? Verse 2 says that he is, this is the second blank, this beast is under the direct authority of the dragon himself. Look at verse 2. And to it, the dragon gave his power, his throne, and great authority. So he is empowered by the dragon, and he is given the authority of the dragon. So basically, all of the dragon's people become now this guy's people. We know that the dragon has angels that follow his bidding. I presume that this means that those angels are now also under the authority of this human figure. So he's under the direct authority of the dragon himself, but that means he's able to carry out the authority of the dragon to anybody that the dragon has authority over. Now, something else we learn about this beast is that part of his rise to power seems to be a remarkable recovery from what is called a mortal wound. Now, John is careful to say that he doesn't die. A mortal wound means, right, you're killed and there's only one thing that can happen, you're going to die. No, you're not dead yet, but there's no avoiding it. There's no medicine, there's no surgery, there's nothing you can do to bring this person back. The wound is mortal, he's going to die. It says here in chapter 13, verse 3, One of its heads seemed to have a mortal wound. Seemed to have. John could have said he had a mortal wound, or he was wounded and died. He could have said it very straightforwardly. Instead, he said he seemed to have a mortal wound, but then it says its mortal wound was healed. It seems like, and again, I know we're reading a little bit into this, but the rise of this particular world leader to prominence and to power comes at a time when he seems to be killed and is brought back to life. Or perhaps he receives a wound that he shouldn't be able to recover from, and somehow, magically, miraculously, powerfully, he is able to still overcome this wound that should have destroyed him. Does that mean somebody's going to try to assassinate him, shoot him in the head, and he falls to the ground, and then instantly he gets raised up by the power of the dragon, and he's like nothing ever happened? I guarantee you, if that happened, that would get the world's attention. Notice how the world responds in verse 3. The whole earth marveled as they followed the beast. In other words, that got their attention. That dude was dead, or supposed to be dead, or almost dead, or on his way to death, and now he got brought back to life. Yeah, I'm going to pay attention to that guy. Now, this is really, really interesting. Because there was another person, right, who died and was brought back to life. It's almost like this guy who's coming along, right, out of the sea to be the leader of the kingdom of the world, it's almost like he's a counterfeit Jesus. He's a pretend version of Jesus. He has happened to him sort of what happened to Jesus, except Jesus actually did die. He actually laid in the grave for 3 days, and on the third day, he rose up to new life. But here's the thing about Jesus. Jesus didn't reappear then in front of the world's cameras and say, hey, I'm back. He basically stayed hidden with his disciples, then he went up to heaven. So there's no proof that Jesus is alive today. In fact, we still argue about it with people who have skepticism about that, okay? And I understand why they're skeptical. It just doesn't happen every day. But this dude, when he gets healed, the world's going to hear about it, the world's going to know it, and they're going to be in awe. They're going to be super, super impressed. In fact, that leads to the next bullet point here. The whole earth will marvel at the beast's healing, that's number one, and notice how they're going to be responding to that sense of marvel. They're going to worship, that's the second blank, both the dragon and the beast. Take a look at verses 3 and 4 again. It says, and the whole earth marveled as they followed the beast, and they worshipped the dragon, for he had given his authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? All right, the whole earth will marvel at the beast's healing, and they'll worship both the dragon and the beast. They're going to think he is absolutely unbeatable. They're just going to think he is amazing. They're going to think he is God-like in his power. He is some kind of a semi-divine or fully divine figure, a man who was God. I'm telling you, this figure is a counterfeit of Jesus Christ. This guy is the answer to what would have happened to Jesus if Jesus had have accepted Satan's offer during the temptation to be given all the kingdoms of the world in his glory. This is exactly what would have happened to Jesus if Jesus had said, sure, sign me up for that. When Satan says, just worship me and you can have all the kingdoms of the earth. This guy is going to get the opportunity to have all the kingdoms of the earth, and the dragon, Satan himself, is going to give him that power, give him that authority, and the world is going to eat it up. They're going to lap it up. They're going to follow him literally to their death. They're going to be super impressed, and they're going to worship him, and they're going to worship the dragon who gave him his authority and his power. But I want you to notice something really interesting. The beast is still under God's authority. God's authority. Take a look with me, if you would, back in verse 5. And it says this, and the beast was given a mouth. Who gave it to him? Okay, put that aside for a minute. And then the second half, it was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. So it was given a mouth that was capable of uttering all kinds of blasphemous things. By the way, that same mouth was capable of uttering all kinds of worshipful things to God too. Okay? This is not a mouth that only had one setting, and that was blasphemy. It has blasphemy, and it also has a worship setting, and this cat turns on the blasphemy setting and turns it all the way to 100. But he's given a mouth, and he's given authority, or was allowed to exercise authority for 42 months. And then again, it later says, down in verse 7, it was allowed to make war on the saints and to conquer them. It was allowed to. Who allowed it to? We'll get back to that. And then it says, and authority was given it over every tribe and people, language, and nation. So 4 times in 2 or 3 verses, there's this reminder that this beast, who, yes, is operating under the control of villain number 1, which is the dragon. Then there's beast number 1. But even he doesn't get to do whatever he wants to do. He's given a mouth, he's given authority, he's given permission, he's allowed to do this, he's allowed to do that. Why? By who? By God. God allows him to be in this place. God raises him up for this moment and allows him to make choices about what he's going to do. And what he chooses to do, of course, is horrifying. But God is still God is still in control over this chump right here. He thinks he's a big shot. He thinks he's God. He thinks he's worshipped as God, that there's nobody on earth better than him. Nobody can stop him. Remember, that's what they say about him in verse 4. Who is like the beast and who can fight against it? Right? He is exalting himself, and he thinks he is the top of the heap. He is the greatest there ever was. And God is all along saying, yeah, I'll allow him to do that. Yeah, I'll give him a mouth. Yeah, I'll give him authority. I'll give him permission to do this. I'll allow him to do that. God in heaven is still drawing the boxes for this cat. And that's comforting to me, because who knows what he would have done if he had been given full permission to do whatever. But there's a limited amount of time, 42 months, that's it. And there's a limited thing he's allowed to do. That's make war on the saints and overcome them, and to be in control and to kind of have authority over the whole earth for a while. It's a limited amount of time, and I'm not saying it's not horrifying, but what I'm saying is God is the one who raised him up. Now, that sounds horrible, right? Like almost like God's responsible, but that's the way it always has been. God raises up every human leader that takes authority in the earth. Every crazy despot that runs wild over the earth and hurts and damages people, God allowed him to be in place. God did not instruct him to do what he did, but God allows him to rise to power and to abuse that power for certain times and for certain purposes. Now, in the end, we don't know how that's all going to work out for God's glory, but he does. And God raises men up and he casts them down. That's the entire point of the book of Daniel, is he takes the lowliest, worst possible people, raises them up whenever he feels like it for purposes only he knows, and he throws them down when their time comes. And it's exactly the same for this dude. So let's not put him on a different category. He's on the exact same scale as every 2-bit dictator who's ever lived on planet Earth. He's under God's authority. He has authority for a short amount of time, and then and I mean this literally, by God, he will be held accountable for how he uses his authority. Okay? But don't forget, he's not running wild. He can't just do anything he wants. He's still under God's authority. Now, who is this beast? I believe this beast is the 11th horn that we talked about back in Daniel chapter 7. Now, I know that was months ago, so you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. So take your beautiful Bibles and flip back to the book of Daniel chapter 7. I've got to show you this one in person. After this, I'll just let you kind of refer back to it on your own time. But Daniel chapter 7 is describing one of these world leaders that's going to come from one of these kingdoms. And he singles out one leader. The horns on these beasts represent human rulers or a king or something like that. And we have here, take a look down in verse 20. Or no, verse 19. Then Daniel's trying to get an explanation for his dream because it freaked him out really bad, as it would have you too. Verse 19, then I desired to know the truth about the fourth beast. Beast, interesting, huh? Yeah, I think John's deliberately trying to tie these two stories together. I don't think it's a mistake or a coincidence. Now, this beast was different from all the rest, exceedingly terrifying with its teeth of iron and its claws of bronze, which devoured and broke in pieces and stamped what was left with its feet. And I wanted to know about the 10 horns that were on its head. Oh, and then the other horn, that's the 11th horn, that came up, and before which 3 of them fell, the horn that had eyes and a mouth that spoke great things, and that seemed greater than its companions. Okay, so this horn rises up after the first 10. So he's at first he's a part of the group, and then he jumps past them, and he brings some of them under his control, and he has eyes, and he has a big mouth, and he seemed greater than his companions, so he's greater than the other kings. And as I looked, verse 21, this horn made war with the saints and prevailed over them until the Ancient of Days came and judgment was given for the saints of the Most High, and the time came when the saints possessed the kingdom. We'll keep going. Verse 23, this is the answer. Thus he said, as for the 4th beast, there shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms. It shall devour the whole earth and trample it down and break it to pieces. As for the 10 horns, out of this kingdom 10 kings shall arise, and another shall arise after them, another king. He shall be different from the former ones, and he shall put down 3 kings. He shall speak words against the Most High, and shall wear out the saints of the Most High, and shall think to change the times and the law. And they shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. But the court shall sit in judgment, and his dominion will be taken away, to be consumed and destroyed to the end. And the kingdom and the dominion and the greatness of the kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom shall be an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. Daniel's prophecies pointed to one king who would rise above all the others, and he would kind of stand out from the crowd in some specific ways. And John, all the way later, I mean, we're talking, this is at least, let's see, how many years? Probably maybe 600 years later, like 3 times the length. Or no, I shouldn't say that, because the settlers came in the early 1600s. So we're talking like 200 years longer than than European colonists settled America. Okay, I know that really didn't help because it took too long. But anyway, for a long, long time, 600 years before, now 600 years later, John is tying back to this and saying, you know who that 11th horn was? It's this first beast. This first beast who's under the authority of the dragon, who has this seemingly mortal wound and is raised to life. And then the whole earth is going to be in awe of this guy, and they're going to follow him. They're going to worship him. But by the way, he's still under God's authority. All right, well, let's go back to Revelation chapter 13. So what is it about this 11th horn that connects it to Daniel 7? Well, first of all, it says he will make arrogant and blasphemous boasts. Boasts, that's the first one. Both Revelation 13 and Daniel 7, I just read it for you, mention the fact that this mouth, he's got a mouth, and it's going to say great things. Well, we know what kind of great things in Revelation 13. Blasphemous things against God, against his name, and against heaven where he lives. He's going to mock, he's going to blaspheme, and I think part of blaspheming is he's going to claim for himself the divinity that only belongs to God. I think he is going to claim that he alone is God. That there is no God in heaven, there is only me. I am that God. And I think he is going to proclaim himself divine, and I think he's going to systematically take over the entire earth. And Daniel said it, and John now ties those two together so you understand he's talking about the same person. So not only does he have a mouth that will make arrogant and blasphemous boasts, but he will have authority for 42 months. Now that's really interesting, because in Daniel chapter 7 verse 25 it says for a time and times and half a time. So that's time, that's 1, times, that's 2, and then half a time, that's a half. So 1 plus 2 is 3, 3 plus a half is 3.5 years. The exact same time frame is listed here. He's going to have authority for just that last part of the tribulation. Remember, I talked to you last week about this, right? Here's the tribulation. There's that thing in the middle called the abomination of desolation. Well, here's what I guess it is. I'm guessing this cat, this beast, parades into God's temple and sets himself up as the alternative God. He is the God that you should be worshiping in this temple. And it seems like later he's going to get an image, an idol of himself that he's going to put there whenever he's not there in the temple. But it's meant to be a thing of self-worship. He comes into God's temple and he sets himself up as God. He's going to have a big mouth and he's going to have authority for 42 months. And then the other thing that shows me that these two, 11th horn and the first beast, are meant to be thought of as the same, is that it says in both passages that he will battle and conquer God's people during this same time. In other words, he's going to be largely successful. He's going to try to destroy God's people. Because again, if you set yourself up as the counterfeit God, there's going to be, I'm going to give you a choice. You want to come on board with me and let me be your God? If you say no, for whatever reason, he's going to hunt you down, he's going to kill you. And the text in Daniel and in Revelation say in both cases that he is allowed to make war and to conquer the saints. There's going to be a lot of people that are dead. A lot of people that are hunted down. A lot of people that are sacrificed to this monster. And he's going to be responsible for that. Now, there's another villain. One last villain. And with this, we're done. The second beast comes up, not out of the sea this time, but arising out of the earth. And to be honest with you, I don't know the significance, the distinction there. I don't know. All I know is that there's a second figure now that appears. And he has a slightly different purpose and a slightly different job description. Okay? But he apparently, well, we'll get back to that in a minute. Let me just read the last 8 verses here of this chapter. Then I saw another beast rising out of the earth. It had 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. Now, first of all, lambs don't have horns. I don't think. Maybe billy goats or something, but I didn't know lambs had horns. But he has 2 horns like a lamb, and it spoke like a dragon. Now, I think what that means is that he also has a direct link to the dragon. The dragon is not just speaking to the first beast, he's also empowering and putting words in the mouth and in the ears and in the head of this second figure as well, this second beast. Now, what does it do? Verse 12, it exercises all the authority of the first beast in its presence and makes the earth and its inhabitants worship the first beast whose mortal wound was healed. Verse 13, it performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. And by the signs that it is allowed to work in the presence of the beast, it deceives those who dwell on the earth, telling them to make an image, that's an idol, a statue, of the beast, or excuse me, for the beast. Sorry. Telling them to make an image for the beast that was wounded by the sword and yet lived. And it was allowed to give breath to the image of the beast, so that the image of the beast might even speak and might cause those who would not worship the image of the beast to be slain. Also, it causes all, both small and great, both rich and poor, both free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is, the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now, this calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Okay, some final points here. Some observations about this second beast. Who is he? What is he all about? Number one, and this is probably pretty obvious, but this beast acts under the authority of the first beast, those are the first 2 blanks, and the dragon, right? It says he speaks like a dragon because the dragon is whispering in his ears. So he's under the authority of the dragon, but he's also apparently, he's under the authority of this beast as well. Now, when it says that he exercises his authority in his presence, I think what that means is he's either some kind of a spokesperson for the beast, right? Speaking with the voice and the authority of the first beast, or he's just sort of like he's like the right-hand man. He's the second in command. He's the next guy in charge, right? Like if something happened to the first beast, this would be the guy who steps into his place, right? So he acts under the authority. So he's in charge of almost everybody else, but he'll answer to the first beast, and he also answers to the dragon. Now, the second thing, this is the most important part. His purpose seems to be more religious in nature, okay? He's focused on one element of things. The first beast is kind of focused on political power. I think this guy is focused in on religious power, spiritual power. And here's his purpose. Are you ready? It's to compel the world to worship the first beast. This guy is often called, in fact, I think later on in the text, he's called the false prophet. What do false prophets do? They lie about what God has said, and they try to get people to believe them so the people will do what they said, not to do what God has said. So it seems like this guy, he exercises this guy's authority, and his job is to compel the world to worship the first beast. He's going to do everything possible to convince the world that the first beast is God, is divine, and deserves to be worshiped. Now, along with that goes the capacity, the next blank, to do great signs to convince people. He's going to be able to in the moment, do some great supernatural thing that's going to freak people out and make people believe that what he's saying is true, or at the very least, put pressure on them to believe and to worship this first beast. Now, you notice the sign that he's allowed to do is the sign of fire falling down from heaven. Do you see that there? It says in verse 13. It performs great signs, even making fire come down from heaven to earth in front of people. Now, the ironic thing is we know what story that's referring back to, right? It's connected to the two witnesses in chapter 11. But even further than that, it's connected back to the story of Elijah in the Old Testament. If you remember, Elijah was living in a time when hardly anybody in Israel believed in the true God. He was like one of the last prophets left who believed in the true God. And all the people, or almost all the people, followed after these other gods, the gods of Baal. And Elijah proposes a test to the prophets of Baal. And he says, look, here's what we'll do. We'll set up two altars. On your altar, you can kill a cow and put it on there. I'll kill a bull and put it on mine. And you pray to your God. I'll pray to my God. And whoever answers with fire, that's the true God. Okay? So, here's the thing. The prophets of Baal try all day. Literally, from the morning, when the sun comes up, through the midday, all the way through the afternoon, until the sun is starting to set. They are screaming to their God, please, a little bit of fire for our altar. Prove to these people that Baal, you are truly God. And Baal does nothing. Zero, zilch, bupkis. Now that's an early 90s expression for you. Elijah mocks them, steps over here, calls the people around the altar and says, let's pray. He says, God, do this, please, to show them that you're real and to bring their hearts back to you again. And he doesn't have to pray. He doesn't have to dance around. He doesn't have to slash himself to make blood flow to get the God's attention. He prays one time, and then everybody has to run for cover because that altar is consumed instantly by fire from heaven. It leaves a gaping hole in the ground because God is that real and God is that powerful. And the people's reaction to that is they fall on their faces and they say, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God. As opposed to Baal. Because Baal is nothing. He couldn't make fire fall from heaven to prove he's God. He's some pathetic, sad, counterfeit imitation. The one true God is the one who can answer with fire. So here we are, Revelation 13. What's happening? You have this being who claims that he came back from the dead, or he came back from what should have been an obvious death. He's alive again, and everybody's in awe of that. And then his crony, his mouthpiece, his false prophet starts telling everybody, this guy is God and you should worship him. And you want me to prove it? Do you want me to prove that he's the true God? I'm going to make fire fall from heaven and come from heaven down to earth. It's a counterfeit. It's a counterfeit. Satan is just cribbing off of God's test. He's just cheating. He's looking over and looking at God's answers, and he's trying to duplicate it. And it's not going to be as great. It's not going to be as impressive, but it's going to still be impressive to the people who see it. And he's going to have the capacity. And again, the issue is proving who is truly God. Now, the funny thing is that in this scenario, God doesn't have an opportunity to respond like in the Elijah story, right? In the Elijah story, it's a contest between 450 prophets of Baal and then one prophet who's Elijah. In this contest, this guy is the only person who gets a chance. Now, the funny thing is this has another connection to Moses when he went before Pharaoh to let my people go. If you remember, Moses had some signs to prove to Pharaoh that you need to listen to me, that God really spoke to me. And one was you throw down your rod and it becomes a snake, right? Well, that's supposed to be impressive, except Pharaoh had some of his magicians who could do the same thing. A counterfeit miracle imitating God's magic and God's power. But God still proved that he was better. Why? Because Moses' serpent swallowed up the other ones. So here's the thing. If this guy, this false prophet, if he were to go side by side with one of God's true prophets, and he were to make fire fall from heaven, and then God's prophet made fire fall from heaven in the same kind of miraculous way, I guarantee you that side by side, it would be incredibly obvious which was the fake and which was real. Just like it was in the time of Elijah, just like it was in the time of Moses and Pharaoh. But he's not going to allow that. He's not going to allow God to have equal time to try to duplicate the miracle. He's just going to show his counterfeit fake miracle, and the effect is going to be pretty intense. The effect is going to be that the people are going to either worship and believe in the first beast or die. That's the next blank. The penalty for not worshiping this image will be death. It'll be death. Now, really interesting thing, I didn't put it in the notes here, but it's in the text, is that not only is he going to say, I want you to worship the beast, but then he says they're going to build an image for this beast. Some kind of a statue, some kind of an idol, maybe that looks like him, and I guarantee you, this idol that they're going to make is going to be the idol that causes the abomination of desolation. They're going to bring that idol into God's temple and set it up and say, worship it, and that's going to be the signal that the second half is about to begin and God's judgment is inevitable and it's going to fall in 3.5 years. And this image is going to be interesting because the image is going to have the ability to, it says he's going to be able to give breath to the image, which means this image is going to be able to speak. It's going to be able, theoretically, to move. I don't know. Is it going to be some kind of a holographic projection? Is it going to be some kind of a walking, moving statue that speaks in the voice and the tone of the first beast? So suppose he's in Africa, killing people in Africa, Christians. He's in Africa and he can holograph himself into his own statue in Jerusalem, and he can walk and he can use the arms and the legs to talk and convince people. But either way, and I'm just making that up. I don't know that that's the way it's going to be. But in some way, the first beast is going to be connected to this image, and this image is going to basically have the authority to either force you to accept and believe in it or die. And I think it's going to be an immediate death sentence. I think they're going to start parading people into this temple and saying, will you worship this image, or do you want to die? One of those two options. And if you say, yes, I'll worship you, then you get to go. In fact, you get a little mark on your hand or on your forehead to say, yes, you are one of the approved worshipers. You did the right thing in the right moment. You can go out and live and buy and sell and go back to normal life. But if you come here and you aren't willing to worship it, they're not going to throw you in jail and then put you on trial and then someday. No, you're going to be somehow executed right in the spot. And the text makes it clear that it seems like the image itself does the executing. So this is not just going to be a statue that stands there. At times it's going to be able to speak, and it's also going to be able to kill people who refuse to worship it. Some kind of a weapon is going to be a part of this. I know it sounds science fiction and it sounds weird, and I don't know how this is going to work. All I know is that it's going to, because the text makes it clear that that's what's going to happen. And it's really interesting. And this leads to my last point here. Everyone who worships the first beast will be compelled to accept some sort of identifying mark, right? And here's we get to the mark of the beast, the mark of the beast. I wish we'd all been ready with our long hair and our short skirts. Back in the 60s, they made the movie, and we've never gotten over it as a culture, right? Because it's just this fascinating concept. And I understand why. It's really interesting stuff and scary stuff. But here's this mark of the beast. And I think the way it's going to work is something like this. People are going to be brought before this image, and they're going to have a choice to make. You worship it, in which case you get marked somehow and sent off, and you can go back to your normal life, or you are killed on the spot for not worshiping this beast. In fact, as they capture Christians from around the world, they may not kill them in these other countries. They might transport them to this temple and then parade them in front of this image and force them to choose in the moment whether to worship the beast or to die for their faith. So I don't know exactly how this is going to play out, but some people are definitely going to get this mark. Now, who does it say? Verse 15. Verse 16, and it causes all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and slave, to be marked on the right hand or the forehead, so that no one can buy or sell unless he has the mark, that is the name of the beast or the number of its name. Now what is this identifying mark? Well, let me just make a couple observations, and with this we're done. This will allow you to engage in commerce, okay? This is going to be your passport to buying and selling. Which apparently, even in a devastated world economy, they're still going to be buying and selling. They're still going to be trading goods and services. That's how humans get along. That's how we've always gotten along. That's how we're going to get along, even in the end times. But here's the thing. Suppose you don't want to worship this beast, but you still want to do business. You want to survive and you want to do business. Well, you got to take the mark. And when you take the mark, you're basically claiming and saying, look, I belong to the beast. Like, I'm on his team. That's what this is. That's what this is. But it's going to allow you to engage in commerce. The second one, this will allow you to avoid being killed, which is a plus, right? You don't want to die, you have to take this mark. But here's the problem, though, is this mark settles you onto his team forever. And it doesn't seem like later on in the text that there's any way back. Like, once you take this step and you make this choice and you take this mark, that's your last choice. After that, it's over. You don't get to choose to go backwards or forwards. You're just stuck there, and you're going to face the consequences of that horrible, horrible truth. Now, what is that? It's a mark of ownership. That's number one. I belong to the first beast. And it's also loyalty. I am loyal to the first beast. Why? Because when I was given the choice, I chose to worship instead of not worship. I chose to live instead of die. I chose to do commerce instead of being cut off from being able to have commerce. That's what I chose. And it's a sign of loyalty. Now, there's only two places in the Bible where you have similar type things happening. One, we've already talked about back in Revelation, I think is chapter 7. In Revelation chapter 7, you have 144,000 Jews who are sealed by God with a sign. Take a look back at Revelation chapter 7, verse 2. Then I saw another angel ascending from the rising of the sun with the seal of the living God, and he called with a loud voice to the four angels who had been given power to harm earth and sea, saying, do not harm the earth or the sea or the trees until we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. Again, later on in Revelation chapter 22, it talks about how God's name is on their foreheads. He's marked them in some specific way. It talks about ownership, okay? So here we go. Once again, God has sealed his people. He's given them some kind of a sign, some kind of a mark that sets them apart as being protected from all the devastation that's going to be here. These 144,000, they're going to be protected from damage and from destruction. They're going to make it through all the devastation alive to the end because God sealed them. He marked them. And that means he owns them and that he's going to protect them. Well, here we go. The beast, what is he doing? He is again counterfeiting, imitating what God is doing. He's selecting out his 144,000 or his group of people who follow him, and he's going to mark them. I own them. They're under my protection. They're under my authority. They do what I say. They're going to do business when I tell them to. They're going to live because I say they should live. He is going to take ownership over them. So Revelation chapter 7, and the only other time you have any kind of a marking or anything like this is all the way back in Genesis chapter 4 with a guy by the name of Cain. Now, I've told this story as well because I find it to be one of the most fascinating in the Bible. Cain kills his brother Abel, and then Cain is caught in the act by God. God calls him to accountability for it. He says, your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. And of course, Cain has his famous line, I'm not my brother's keeper. It's your job to keep track of your people. I'm just, you didn't like my gift, and so I killed him, and it's your job to protect him, and I took his life. So how good a job did you do protecting Abel, right? Cain's very arrogant. God comes back at him, and he says, look, buddy, you get this punishment. You're going to wander throughout the earth, and you're going to be a horrible wanderer, and you're not going to be able to farm anymore. You're going to be dependent upon me. This is not going to be a happy, pleasing, happy life. And Cain goes, my punishment is too great. I can't bear it, please. And he says, anybody who comes across me is going to kill me. Because he understood, even back in the early days of human civilization, that if you took somebody's life, the only appropriate response was for you to pay with your life. It was very, very obvious even back then in Cain's day. And so God says, not so, not so. And so God marked Cain. He put a mark on Cain somehow. And that mark was a sign that God was shielding Cain from the consequence of killing his brother. It's a mark, ironically, of grace. It's a mark of God's grace in his life. And whenever anybody comes over and says, I want to punish you for what you did to Abel, they saw the mark and they backed away. Oh, God is sealing him off. God is drawing a big line around him saying, do not touch. Cain belongs to me. I will deal with Cain. And I think those are the only two. And so that's where the devil here, or where the second beast, the image of the first beast, gets this idea to mark his own people. It's to show his sign of ownership and that he's in control and they belong to him and they exist under his grace and his goodwill and his good wishes. He's mocking, he's counterfeiting, he's imitating God, like a little kid dressing up in her mom's clothes, like a little boy dressing up in dad's outfits, trying to prove that they're a big boy on the earth, trying to prove that the kingdoms of the world are just as great or greater than the kingdom of the Lord, of our Lord and his Christ. And it's going to become very obvious throughout the course of this that it's all a game, it's all a fake, it's all a joke, it's all a counterfeit. And one day it'll be revealed for what it is. Now, one last statement, and then I'm done. It talks about the number of the beast, right? The number of the mark of the beast. And verse 18 says, this calls for wisdom. Let the one who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is the number of a man, and his number is 666. Now, please believe me when I say this. No one alive today on planet Earth knows exactly what the number 666 means or why it's important. Nobody knows. Nobody has any idea. There's not any cross-reference from this to some other passage of Scripture somewhere else that gives the answer. There's no secret coding in the Greek language that gives you some kind of a numerical equivalent and you get the name John F. Kennedy or something. Like that just doesn't happen. There's nothing there. There's just one verse. Now, what I find fascinating about this is that John does seem to suggest that this number will have significance, but it's not significance to us today or even the people in the first century who are reading it. It has significance to the people reading it who live during this time period. If you live during the tribulation, if you live during the 70th week of the book of Daniel, and somehow the number 666 is going to be significant, and if you have wisdom and you have understanding, you're going to be able to calculate the meaning of this number. And maybe in some small way, it's going to shine a light on the fact that this beast is a counterfeit. He's a fake. Because remember, the message going around the world is going to be that he's the real deal. He's really God. This is who we should have been worshiping all these millennia. And he's finally come and he's set up his kingdom and it's wonderful and it's great and you get to be a part of it. And somehow this number 666, there's going to be some way to calculate it in that time frame that's going to allow you to see through the lie and realize that is just a man. Yeah, he had this thing happen. I don't know what happened, but this miracle that he experienced, that doesn't mean he's God. It doesn't mean he's from God. It could mean that he's empowered by Satan. And you're going to somehow, if you calculate at that time, there's going to be more information either in the world or whatever, and they're going to be able to figure out, if they have wisdom, if they have understanding, they're going to be able to calculate it out. And I don't think that's for today. I think John wrote that for the generation who reads this, who are living through these events. And they say, look, you do the math. You figure it out. This will help you then. It doesn't help us today. We're kind of lost and in the dark. But someday when these events come about, they're going to be able to understand it and calculate it and figure it out. Okay? So these are the villains. There's a dragon. He's horrible. He empowers these two beasts. And we have a first beast who's a political leader who's going to have a mouth that does great boasts. He's going to conquer the world. He's going to try to destroy Christians. He's going to force the world to worship him. And he's going to have a crony, this second beast, his false prophet, who's going to force the world. They're going to create this image. They're going to parade all of humanity in front of it and make them make a choice. Choose the beast and live, or choose to reject the beast and not worship him and die. And the ones who choose to worship him are going to get a mark, and that mark, unfortunately and sadly, it's going to be their death sentence. And they're going to stick with that. And they're going to be punished along with the two beasts, along with the dragon, when God's kingdom finally comes to destroy and crush the kingdom of the world and replace it with the kingdom of the Lord and of his Christ. That's where this is headed. So where are we going next? Chapter 14 shows that there are still people on earth who are not on board with the kingdoms of this world. There are still people that are worshiping God, that are staying faithful to him, and the attention's going to shift a little bit before we get into these last final judgments from God, these bowls of wrath that are poured out on the earth that kind of signal that this is the end. This is the final movement of God's wrath. This is the last bit of the story to come. And we'll get to that next week, right before Christmas. Isn't that going to be wonderful? I'm sorry that this series it's not very Christmassy. It's not very fun and upbeat and warm fuzzies. You don't feel like you just drank hot chocolate when you read this. But it's God's word, and I don't apologize for that much. And I hope that it's encouraging to you and that you remember that we're still fighting these enemies today in a slightly different form, different context, different level of obviousness, but Satan is still active. He's still trying to devour and destroy us. He's still our adversary, and the only way that we can beat Satan is we stand firm, we put on the armor of God, and we refuse to let go of the truth. And that is how we win. It's how we win today. It's how they're going to win in that last era before Jesus comes back to replace the kingdoms of the world with the kingdoms of the Lord and of his Christ. Love you guys. See you next Sunday.